Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming this evening. I'd like to thank Max Hipkins and Kevin Morgan for hosting the screening this evening. I'd also like to thank Lynn and Linda for all their help in bringing this together. When I was first approached by my hosts to come to Perth and screen this film, I told them that I didn't have a silver bullet. I had no more status, basically, than a very ordinary man who was thrown into the eye of a storm, saw a corrupt process at hand, and decided to say something about it. I never imagined that first day when I walked out into the street and started to film grand old Federation houses being destroyed, trees being cut down and chainsawed, ancient old trees that had given the neighbourhood its ambience for generations, that the final story would touch a nerve with people in many parts of Australia. And as reaction from the film started to filter back, I began to realise there was a common disquiet. People felt they were losing control of their environment and the place they call home. The common thread seems to be a gnawing feeling that our freedoms are slowly being whittled away at the behest of a powerful few. So freedom, that's basically what this documentary is all about. Freedom not only to have your say, but to actually determine what happens in the place you call home. Not planning panels, not DAPs or whatever governments and other parts of the country want to call them. Not unelected bureaucrats, not developer lobby groups, not experts, because you, the people who live in those suburbs, are the experts. You know what should and shouldn't take place. You know what should and shouldn't happen in the place you call home. You know, when you read the policy statements from governments and they contain phrases like cutting red tape, fast tracking, certainty, you know what they are? They're code. They're code for ripping away your rights. Now, what they don't like are people who might aspire to a house with a small backyard where a boy or a girl can have a dog. Because people who care about their environment, people who care about their history, people who care about the heritage of where they live, stand in the way of progress. And when you stand in the way of progress, you stand in the way of the economy. Now, it's obvious we live in a free, democratic, capitalist democracy. And for most of us, not all, but for most of us, it's worked very well and it's improved the quality of our life. The problem is that this arrangement has become rapacious and greedy for bigger profits. And as a result, instead of improving the quality of our life, it's going to, as you saw in that documentary, gradually detract from the quality of our life and rip from us our freedoms. You as a community are very fortunate. You have candidates who've recognised an emerging fact. And that fact is the old two-party system no longer works. It does work, but it doesn't work for us. Both the major parties are influenced by a coterie of powerful lobbyists and donations. And unless you have a strong independent on your side, or a strong third force, once the election's over, you don't stand a chance. As the American comedian and political commentator George Kalin has said, it's a big club and you're not in it. I'd like to basically wrap up what I'm saying with a quote from the radical American journalist Molly Elvins. And she said, "Throughout our life, we have another job. And that job is we are citizens. I would add, we have a responsibility as citizens to oppose any force that seeks to rob us of the democratic rights and our freedoms." You've seen the history of New South Wales, and I hope it acts as a warning. With what I've said about the two major parties, recall what the Mayor said. You fight the state government, you lose. You negotiate with the state government, you lose. You just never win. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe you are in possession of a ray of light, a ray of hope. You have candidates that offer you an alternative. I envy you. Thank you.
What we'd like to do now is get a bit of discussion going. I'd like, if any of you have any questions for Dennis, if you'd like to try and draw out some comparisons between what's happening here and what happened in New South Wales. Basically, the next 15 minutes is up to you to make what you want. We brought Dennis over. Try and get what you can out of him while he's here. He's a valuable resource, and make the most of it. Any
Actually,
questions?
I have to correct you there, Max, very kindly. The real intelligence and the real valuable resource is actually in those people that I interviewed. They gave me a great education, those people, and I give them great credit. That's why the film goes through to the final credits. It's out of courtesy, particularly to people like Jack Mundy and John Hatton, who gave their time and their experiences for the documentary. I simply tagged along, but I have learned a little bit, so I am happy to answer as best I can your questions.
Yes.
Dennis, where are we now with the O'Farrell government with their planning? Have they implemented real change? I understand they repealed the existing legislation, but where does that stand now?
Well, I'll leave you make a judgment. I'll just tell you a few things. You will recall in the documentary Barry O'Farrell's comment about the Urban Task Force, that he agreed with former ICAC Commissioner John Mant that they were actually the fundraising arm within the property sector of the New South Wales Labor Party. We have now a draft green paper on a new planning act, and the people who are given some of the greatest prominence within that and who are the happiest with what is happening with that new draft planning act is the Urban Task Force. Something John Hatton said to me when I interviewed him, and I interviewed John for an hour, so obviously I couldn't put it all into the documentary. But after 22 years in Parliament, John's, being an independent, said to me, "I notice a lot of things, but one thing has never left me." He said, it didn't matter which of the major parties were in Parliament, power went from top to top. Nothing changed. I can tell you now there is great discontent, not amongst the development lobby, but amongst resident action groups throughout all of New South Wales with what is happening and what is written into that new draft paper, that new planning act that is proposed. The government did the right thing to start with. They did throw out Part 3A, which gave the minister basically carte blanche to do whatever he wanted. They did do that. But a lot of the input that has gone into the new Act has come from the development lobby. They sent out 2 consultants, 2 former politicians, one Labor, one Liberal, to travel the state and take in from ordinary citizens such as yourself what people would like to see in the new Planning Act. Most of the reports that they brought back have been discarded in favour of suggestions from the planning, the development lobby.
Is there just a quick follow-up to that? Is there best practice recognised anywhere in Australia?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert on. I'm not an expert on this. I'm a filmmaker. Is there best policy anywhere in Australia? No, I don't know. You'd have to ask somebody from another state that question.
Yes, Ken.
Dennis, I think Max is better equipped to answer this question, but about 12 months ago we had a radical act introduced into West Australia, the Metropolitan Redevelopment Act. How does that compare with Part 3A that's referred to in that film?
If you like to answer that, Max.
The Metropolitan Redevelopment Act here in Western Australia gives a government agency the right to acquire and develop any land to disregard the requirements of any town planning scheme. I think it's slightly different. In New South Wales, the emphasis was on ministerial power to grant approvals to the development industry. We've gone, not only do we do that in Western Australia through the development assessment panels, but we've also got this government developer, which is the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority, and its powers are very, very wide. And this is where we've seen a number of parklands earmarked for development on the Perth waterfront, Riverside land at East Perth, Point Perrin. I've heard the chairman of the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority say that as soon as the new stadium at Burswood is in operation, then they'll look at Subiaco Oval and downsizing that and selling off land there in the same way as Claremont Oval is in the process of being downsized. So, and just in the paper this week, there was the East Fremantle Football Club, the same thing is happening there. So this is institutionalised development, which I don't think, maybe Dennis can comment on that, but certainly from my perception, I don't think it's anywhere like what's happening here.
It sounds like it's more draconian here than it was in New South Wales.
I think it is, yes. Was there a government developer that was doing this sort of work in New South Wales? Or were they mainly private developers?
Mainly private.
Yes.
Dennis or Max, when you mentioned East Fremantle with raising objections to the local government, our local government authority over the carve-up, so they got to the same status as Kings Park, and we've sort of started to resist it. We had just for your information, an elections meeting on Monday night, which whilst it didn't quite parallel the one that you showed, got a bit heated at times, which was great. But I just wanted to make a point, we only became alerted to this, and I suppose everybody's in the same situation, through accident. There was no public consultation since 2008 when the last plan was prepared about the open resisted fall off the commercial development, which is what they want to do now, quite a significant proportion of it. So there's that sort of hiding. Now, how do you get around that? FOI, or just keep tabs on their minutes, in which case we'll go underground and do the same thing. Also, I learned in September that the local government authority had paved the way for legislative change by meeting with Minister Day, Minister for Recreation, and the three ministers way back in September. We knew nothing about this until now, and it's blown up in all our faces. So we're a bit cross about that.
Mrs. Logan, do you wish to speak about that, Max?
Well, I suppose it picks up on the point that Dennis raised, that you must be forever vigilant. And if you develop your networks either before or as a consequence of something appearing to go wrong, it does bring communities together. I know in the city of Nedlands, the Waratah Avenue development got the Nedlands Electors Association going, which developed into the Western Suburbs Alliance. I know here in Subiaco there have been many poor decisions made by the DAPs, and that's generated community groups in Subiaco. So once those groups are there, there are many more eyes watching what's going on, and with the internet these days, it doesn't take long to make everybody aware of what's going on. So the more people you have working with you, the more you learn and the more you're in a position to do something about it. Yes.
On political donations, Dennis, there was reference there to the Labor government was going to change the law right at the end, dying days. Do you know what the current position in New South Wales is? If so, do you believe it is satisfactory? And Max, what's the situation in WA?
Well, as you saw in that, political donations have now been, well, they were at the completion of this film, political donations from developers, not donations, but specifically from developers, have been banned in New South Wales, basically as a result of the enormous agitation of people like Lee Rhiannon and the Greens. But there are loopholes, and the clever way around it is that there are enough developers will form a number of shelf companies and run the donations underhand through that. But look, donations or not, governments will always follow the path of developers, basically because they like what they do. They like, as Barry O'Farrell said in a newspaper article recently in Sydney, they like to see cranes in the sky because it brings in taxes and it means your economy is growing. So, donations or not, governments will always sing the tune of developers.
Yes.
I'd like to highlight the use of SAT, the State Administrative Tribunal, the way it's used by developers. Very briefly, there's a development in my street in Darlington. It's a 4-block development which does not comply with the local planning laws at all. It does not comply with any one of them. That was done by the developer deliberately applying to Mundaring Shire Council for a development which he knew would be refused. He needed the refusal, which he then took to SAT and appealed against the Mundaring Shire decision. The decision was turned around by SAT and was then sent back to Mundaring Shire, where it was reluctantly approved so they could get on with their life. Now, in the eastern states, as I understand it, third parties can appear at inquiries into appeals by developers. In Western Australia, we're locked out. Now, this has had an influence over this particular development, and I'm quite sure it happens many times over. I don't think SAT refuses anybody anything. Is there something that can be done about that?
There has been the odd occasion where the SAT has allowed individuals to be joined to the action, but that is most unusual. Yes.
I know why. If a third party applies to support the developer, he may speak. If he speaks against the development, he doesn't speak. That is a fact.
That's correct, Jim. Yes, and I certainly have experienced myself developers putting in ambit claims, they get rejected, they go to the SAT, and a compromise is reached. And the members of the SAT, some I know personally, will admit that their job is to seek a compromise. And so very rarely do they come down fully supporting one side or the other. They try to reach a compromise, and this means that there is a middle situation that's approved.
I can assure you there was no compromise. There were 25 of us at the meeting where that development was approved. We were beaten by one Darlington ratepayer who was the developer. 25 other ratepayers couldn't win the case, which gets back to the point about power, whether it's in local government, state government or Commonwealth.
Yes, I agree. Yes, Greg.
Thanks for the film. The parallel to the New South Wales and WA is, pretty much on track. Except we've been able to compulsorily acquire land a lot earlier than the New South Wales did. The public participation, I think Damien mentioned recently, public participation has been a fundamental part of town planning that's just seemed to be forgotten, or the populace doesn't seem to understand the implications. So there might be public participation on rezoning all of Max's new electorate to R60, and people don't really know what that means. R60, R20, R40. But of course, R60 means that there's a death sentence virtually on every house in the electorate. Okay? And the other thing is where the participation happens, and then later on you sort of get ignored, is when a master plan is adopted. So a master plan is adopted, public participation on the master plan is adopted, and then it's implemented without any further consultation. So the master plan may have said to provide for old age homes in the electorate of Nedlands and increase the density in selected sites, or some nice motherhood statement, but then the implication with the implementation is what destroys your amenity. And in theory, town planning is about the preservation of amenity. And when it was established here, that's what the goals were. Over time, it's just become totally taken over by the development industry, who talk about development facilitation. With the new act that came in about 5 years ago, I went to the Ministry for Planning and heard Eric Lumsden, a top bureaucrat that stays as a top bureaucrat in planning no matter whether you had the Labor Party or the Liberal Party, right? Eric Lumsden gave a talk on planning for 2.5 hours, never mentioned the preservation of amenity once. It was all about development facilitation. And over the time, Town Planning and Development Act came about in 1928. Maybe up until the last 20 years, I think planners were still interested in the preservation of amenity. But in the last 10, 20 years, it's just become a developer's picnic. And, as a former town planner of Eastern Mantle, I was subject to constant harassment and abuse and 2 ministerial inquiries because I said the purpose of town planning is the preservation of amenity, not development facilitation.
Thanks, Greg. Alex.
I just wanted to add a few words to what Greg said. I think part of the problem is also that we have people in local government who are not acting in the interests of their electors, residents and ratepayers. And we've had people on that panels who really shouldn't have been there because they were not there representing the local community. So this is why we're losing our amenity, because people who should be there protecting it for us are not actually doing that job. And I think there's a problem because under the Local Government Act, councillors are supposed to act in the interests of electors, residents and ratepayers. And this is all too often not happening. So we've got state and local governments working together and locking out communities, and we're seeing it repeated. It's happening all over the place.
But even I do, you've got to tweak this
Yes.
Certainly what you say is the case, but even where the local government appointed DAP members do stand up for local interests, they are outnumbered on the development assessment panel.
I said that too, but what I'm saying is all too often we've got people in local government who stitch things up long before the communities even know about it, you know, and there's evidence of that, and I won't mention names, but it has been happening, and people have to realise that sometimes the problem is actually with the people on local government.
Yes.
I'd like to add to that. It seems to be, maybe not in the city of Nedlands, but also seems to be that the town planners employed across the local governments in WA seem to act as though they're implementing the wishes of the WA Planning Commission.
I certainly agree with that.
They've sort of completely forgotten that they're employed by, the local government, I would say to preserve the amenity of the local government, but they're constantly acting, saying, oh, the WA Planning Commission says this. Their own town planning scheme may say to preserve amenity, and invariably does, and they'll go, oh, WA Planning Commission said this, and maybe they're so interested in career paths into the Ministry for Planning, I don't know. But the whole zeitgeist seems to be the adoption of what the WA Planning Commission have to say.
I would certainly agree with that. I would say 80% of the planning profession is in favour of higher densities because they think it makes public transport work better, which is a fallacy. But yes, the majority of the planning profession supports higher densities, and they think they're doing the community a favour. They think they know best, and they're imposing their will on local communities.
If it is their perception, they won't have a career if they don't.
Well, let's hope so. Yes, Max.
I have a question. With the, I think it was Part 3A of the legislation that changed and took away heritage powers and environmental powers at the discretion of the Minister. A sort of a general question, were you aware of any legal challenges that served any useful purpose in trying to overcome the power of the legislation?
Are you addressing that question to me?
Yes.
Right. Yes, there was. I can give you an example right now. The Coringo Council that you saw in that documentary, a prime area of Sydney, in many ways, albeit it doesn't have your wonderful seaboard and the beaches, but it's a prime area of Sydney and a very expensive area to get into, and the developers eyed that off and knew they could make a lot of money there. The state government gave directions to Coringo Council to increase its density and its population, and every time the council came up with something, the government threw it back at them and increased it again, and this went on and on and on. And you saw the frustration in the former mayor of Coringo there. What ultimately happened was the government gave up on negotiating with the council and imposed that planning panel and took away the planning powers from the council entirely and put the staff in charge of drawing up new plans and new densities for the community. At that time, the councillors and particularly the mayor were not even allowed to talk to the staff about what was happening. Anyway, the council took the state government, the Minister for Planning, to the Land and Environment Court and challenged his authority on taking away their power. They lost the case.
Yes.
Dennis, thank you for producing State at Sea. It's a documentary which deserves a wider audience than just in groups of 100 at a time. What successes have you had in getting free-to-air distribution? I'd certainly like to see it on at least WTV in WA.
It is going to be screened on a community channel here just prior to the election. It's WTV, is it?
Yes.
Max?
Yes.
44.
Yes.
Channel 44, they're doing it. My co-producer on the program, Jeffrey Nottage, is a very successful director. He's an Australian Film Institute award winner for a series called Palace of Dreams that he did with the ABC. And when Jeff and I both went to the ABC and sought funding for some help on this documentary, they wouldn't touch it, in spite of Jeffrey's reputation. And I have a feeling they thought, well, you should leave this sort of thing to us, to Four Corners, or something like that. I completed the documentary out of my own savings. We went back to the ABC and to SBS with a completed documentary, and they still wouldn't screen it. I have no idea why. You can make up your own mind about that.
It's after 9 o'clock. I think we'll bring it to...
Can I just make one comment just to Dennis? Dennis, developers will always find a way of getting around the laws which forbid donations to political parties. Like, for instance, in Perth, we have an outfit called Leaders Forum, and they are a group of 12 people who just put in $25,000, and they have an open sesame session with the Premier and the Minister for Planning. And I just wonder whether that would be shot down by your legislation on the East Coast.
No, not at all. Well, we have similar outfits in New South Wales. That's why I made the point that the two major parties, both of them, both Liberal and Labor, rely very heavily on donations. We're not just talking about developers here. You know, they've received donations from a whole range of industries. And they are influenced by very powerful lobbyists.
One of the problems, or no, not one of the problems, but the reality of our situation is that one of the developers, Jerry Hansen, he just simply said, well, we get together and all we do is tell the ministers how to do their job.
Yeah, do you believe that?
Well, I do believe it. That's what we tell them how to do.
Okay, I think we'll call it a halt there. Please show your appreciation to them. Please tell your friends it's on again, same show is on again.